Welcome back, everybody, to our 5-minute Bible study series. Today we're talking about Psalm 68, and I can promise you that this is not going to be done in 5 minutes. If you read the chapter, you probably are going to know why. If you were confused after reading Psalm 68, do not fear. You are not the only one. I certainly read it, and I was like, "Whoa, what is going on here?" Went to some of my favorite commentators, old guys who lived like 300 years ago, Adam Clarke and Albert Barnes, and John Wesley and some of these other guys that I use, and even the great Adam Clarke, who has plenty to say on just about everything. He said, "I do not know where to begin commenting on Psalm 68. He said, I believe it was him, or maybe it was another guy, said that Psalm 68 has some of the most difficult passages to make sense of in all of the Bible. And part of the reason for that is because, as we've discussed in other Psalms, we don't always have the context of when, historically, timeline-wise, these psalms were written. And so we're kind of left to guess like what this language applies to. And that's not always the case. It's usually not the case when it comes to interpreting verses. You might find a hard verse in like Isaiah, for example, but Isaiah is like talking about a theme. When Isaiah lives in history, you can line up his life with the books of the kings and the books of the prophets, other prophets, and you can say, oh, okay, this probably applies to, this particular event, or he's talking about this particular thing. But in Psalm 68, we don't have hardly any context to work with. And so some of these expressions are pretty difficult to interpret. And so you and I are not the only ones who are confused. We will do our best, as others have done in the past, to understand Psalm 68 to the best of our ability. I guess we better get into it so this doesn't end up being 15 minutes. Now, we do know that Psalm 68 was written by David, so it's a psalm of David, and we do finally have a New Testament reference back to this psalm. Psalm 68 is referenced in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 8. Themes somewhat similar to what we've seen in the past. Number one, God's enemies will be scattered like smoke. Number two, God cares about the helpless, like orphans, like widows, people imprisoned unfairly, people like that. God is worthy of praise of all of the nations. That's number three. And then our definitions. We do have some unique ones today. Sinai is the first one. Now, you might know this one if you're with us for previous studies. It appears in verse 8. Sinai was a mountain that was visited by the Israelites when they left Egyptian slavery after the 10 plagues. God appeared to Moses on Mount Sinai, and that's where God gave Moses the 10 commandments and his law for the nation of Israel. Mount Zalmon is another mountain that's mentioned in verse 14. Now, this one is much less significant to kind of the overall Bible story. This was a small peak that was near the city of Shechem. Zalmon is close to Mount Ebal, which we talked about Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, where the law was read back. I want to say that was Numbers, but don't quote me on that. So those mountains we've seen, but Mount Zalmon was close to that, but seems like it was not as significant a mountain as Ebal or Gerizim. Finally, we have Bashan. This is a region in the northernmost part of the Promised Land. It fell within the territory of the tribe of Manasseh on the east side of Galilee, on the east side of the Jordan River. We need our map back today, but you're going to have to look those up on your own because there's no space for a map. I barely fit our outline and application on page number 2. Let's go over there and cover those. I've broken this down into as small sections as I could to try to help us understand just piece by piece. This first section is, this isn't the difficult section, we'll say that. This is verses 1 through 3. God scatters the enemies. God's enemies stand no chance against him. It says that he scatters them like smoke. Just blow it away. Or an interesting illustration here, they flee like melting wax before a flame. The wicked will perish, but the righteous will find joy in God's salvation. So this great God is described in the first section. Now we're going to talk about a God who is great, but also a God who cares about helpless people. Many rulers in the earth display, greatness through their power, through their mighty deeds, but far fewer of them also care about people who can't help themselves. God leads the helpless through the desert, verses 4 through 10. So the text presents an image of God leading helpless people through a desert of despair. God is the helper of the helpless. He gives homes to those who have no families. He advocates for the orphans. He gives freedom to those who are unjustly imprisoned, and he protects widows. One great example of God's care for the weak is the care for the nation of Israel as they were passing through the wilderness after they had gotten out of slavery in Egypt and they were on their way to the promised land. They needed God's help for that whole journey, and God was there to provide. And so the psalmist reminds his countrymen how God had cared for their ancestors in the wilderness and of God's great power that was displayed at Mount Sinai. When God gave the law to Moses on Mount Sinai, there was a cloud that came down, says the whole mountain shook. There was lightning, I believe, and fire, and it was just a great display of God's power coming down to help these helpless people and to care about their lives and to give them his law so that they could have fellowship with him, even though they're nothing compared to him. Now, verses 11 through 14, things do start to get a little bit difficult. We've titled this section, God Achieves the Victory for His People, and His People Benefit. So next, the psalmist speaks of a great victory, a victory that God had won for his people, but the specific victory, the context, is missing. We don't know exactly what this victory was. We're told that women announced the victory in the streets and they divided the spoils of war. And two pictures are presented in connection with this victory. Number one, a dove covered with gold and silver. And number two, snow falling on Mount Zalmon, one we talked about in our definition section. But it's difficult to say the original author's purpose, what he was trying to communicate by using these pictures. There's a large diversity of opinions about what these pictures might mean and on the proper interpretation, and so it is a very challenging text. The next section, verses 15 through 23, is also a bit challenging. The mountain of Bashan. The psalmist described a mountain in that territory of Bashan that we defined, and this mountain was envious of God's mountain. God's mountain probably refers to Mount Zion, where the city of Jerusalem was built. The mountain in Bashan, we're not told exactly why it was envious, but perhaps it was bigger, perhaps it was taller than the Lord's mountain. But God didn't need the greatness of that mountain to protect his people, because the text says that he had chariots numbering twice 10,000, thousands upon thousands in verse 17. So he could protect his people on whatever mountain they chose, even if it wasn't the highest or the biggest or the most strategic. The text says that God, quote, ascended on high and took his enemies captive. God was Israel's salvation, and his power gave them victory over their enemies. Okay, so now we're finally on our last section, verses 24 through 35, a procession of worship. A procession of people is described here, a procession of praise and worship. Singers and musicians perform songs of blessing to God. Some commentators and interpreters think that this has to do with the Ark of the Covenant being brought into the city of Jerusalem. That's possible, but we just don't have enough information to say certainly, at least not at this point. Several of the tribes of Israel are specifically mentioned as participating in this procession. Verses 27 reads, there is Benjamin, the least of them, in the lead, the princes of Judah in their throng, the princes of Zebulun, the princes of Naphtali. God's power was going to be known throughout the entire earth, and the psalmist says that even foreign dignitaries would come and honor the Lord. And the psalm ends with a call for all people to worship the mighty God of Israel, to recognize that the God of Israel is the true God. The final couple verses read this way. O kingdoms of the earth, sing to God, sing praises to the Lord, to him who rides in the heavens, the ancient heavens. Behold, he sends out his voice, his mighty voice. Ascribe power to God, whose majesty is over Israel and whose power is in the skies. So I guess to sum this chapter up, I think the overall idea of the chapter is pretty clear, even though some of the finer details are a little bit hard to interpret. It's basically a psalm about the greatness of God, how God has blessed his people Israel, how he has blessed Jerusalem and Mount Zion, how God has superiority over the enemies, and how God is the true God. And I think that's pretty much the big picture. So it is a tough psalm, but overall I think we can put together kind of the main themes that David is trying to express here. So our application quickly before we finish up, Jesus' work is seen in several ways and is paralleled in several ways in Psalm 68. The first one is that Jesus wins or won the victory for us, defeating the devil and sin so that we could enjoy the benefit. The psalmist in verses 11 through 13 talks about how God won the battle. It wasn't won by the strength of men, but his people get the spoils. They get the blessing from the victory that God has achieved. The battle against sin, against Satan, against death was not won by our strength, but we receive the blessings because of Jesus' death and resurrection where he defeated those things. The second way is kind of related but slightly different and pulls in another verse. Jesus' work is pictured in verse 18. Paul actually quotes from verse 18 in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 8. That verse reads this way in Ephesians. He says, when Jesus ascended on high, he led a host of captives and he gave gifts to men. So Jesus ascended to heaven after taking captive what once held us captive, Satan, death, and sin. Jesus conquered those things by his death and his resurrection, and because of that, we receive the blessings of victory. So there's a lot that points to Jesus in Psalm 68. Obviously, here David's pointing to just the greatness and the superiority of God, but that's going to be displayed to a greater degree 1,000 years after David lived, when God conquers the ultimate enemies through the sacrifice of his son. Thanks for joining me for Psalm 68. Was it 15 minutes? I don't know. It might have been close. But thanks for hanging in there. Tomorrow, Psalm 69. I promise it's a little bit easier.